So, hi to everybody. The title of my talk is The Right Time of Being Late, Some Reflections on the Affinity Between Philosophy and Translation. And it's a part of the project I'm currently working on. But for this occasion, I would like to start from some general remarks on the temporality of translation, or what would be the time structure of translating practice. So, the commonsensical view places translation at a subsequent time, or in a certain afterwardness. It means that translation is simply defined as an activity or result of an activity that comes after something other, which acts as an original, as a source, endowed with already expressed and established sense, from which then the translational process starts and develops. Translation is therefore an after speech, we can say, or a Nachschrift, Nachrede, a post-text or post-discourse. But what does exactly this coming after of translation indicate? What is the epistemological, ontological, ethical, and political meaning of its positioning after something? If translation is something subsequent, a posterior act, or a later product, how could we define the temporality of translation it's being after? When does translation actually happen? Or rather, when does its afterwardness happen? Translation is later than the original, später als das Original. This is a Benjamin's claim in his text, The Translator's Task, which offers a very interesting insights regarding the translational temporality, what is exactly my topic in this talk. German philosopher is actually well aware of the semantic ambiguity that the term später has in his language. It means after, later as subsequent, coming in the future, but spät in the first place means late, as delayed, belated, coming not only after something, but occurring also, so to say, in a wrong moment or in unsuitable, improper time. So später, later, can be read in double way. It means after, but if we take it literally or translate it wordly, it means also more late, in a sense of an excess of lateness. The main starting point of my argument is that this notion of coming after or being late, and especially literal meaning of more late, contained in the very word später, reveals us the genuine temporality of translation, that is, its historical character. And my thesis would be that with this claim that Benjamin's claim that translation is later than original, he does not assert a simple chronological posteriority. Translation does not come only after an original text, it is also late. And being late says something more than just coming after. It implies that we missed something, something is over, and we are not on time. An event or a process has already begun, and we didn't arrive at its beginning. So what is missed is exactly the origin of the process. That's why arriving late always entails a sense of loss. There is a missed occasion or an opportunity we didn't take because we were slow or simply we let it slip. But at the same time, arriving late always inspires the hope that it is not really too late. In that case, too lateness could mean that an expected event has already finished, so we miss not only its beginning, but its end as well. To say then that the translation is later than the original could mean that the translation is in a condition of the permanent loss or disadvantage in relation to the original. It structurally misses the original, but it still hopes to catch up to it. The translation, therefore, happens at the moment not only later in the time or later than the original, but at the moment it is also, so to speak, wrong or improper. The lateness of translation indicates that the original event already has begun or it has already happened. So we must come to terms with the inability to follow it in time. The translation cannot go hand in hand with the original because they remain separated by a time gap. That's why belatedness of translation is a sign of a certain irreversibility, that is, the impossibility to reconstruct or regain the original state. And this impossibility is the main character of historical time. So translation is belated because its existence is profoundly historical. But from this, it would be too hasty to conclude that the time of the original is right, rechtzeitig, while the time of the translation would be inappropriate. If we go beyond the dichotomy of the wrong right, we could ask actually whether the advantage of translation, its special effectiveness, lies precisely in its belatedness, in its being out of time. Is not the inopportune moment of translation its true moment, its kairos? We already stressed the double meaning of the word später, its ambiguous connotation. So the fact that translation is later than the original can also be interpreted as a recognition of the delay already existing in the temporality of the original. The original also occurs late, but the delay of translation is excessive, it is more late. This would mean that the temporal gap in the original is visible only from the position of its translation, of its more lateness. Translation, therefore, enables us to grasp that even its original does not inhabit its own time in an authentic way. The temporal difference at stake then would not be that one between a proper and opportune time of the original on the one hand and the disadvantaged, disjointed, belated time of the translation on the other. Because what the source text and the translation have in common would nevertheless be one and the same temporality of being in delay, not being on time. The difference between these two would lie only in the degree of delay, in its intention. But how to understand this delay in the structure of the original that translation only brings to the fore? We could say that such a temporal gap that marks delay, the being late, is precisely the element that opens the original to the historical horizon. So the original continues to live on in its own further late translation. The point is here that what is not able to inhabit its own time is destined to have a history, to be continuously translated, and therefore to inhabit other languages as well. What is emerging here through the lens of belatedness is the relationship, the intrinsic relationship between translation and historicity. It must be said that there are also other spots in Benjamin's text where the problem of Spätsein, of coming late, appears. For example, in the first quote from Benjamin's text, I will not read it all, just the last sentence where Benjamin says that in translations, the original's life achieves its constantly renewed, latest, and most comprehensive development, späteste Entfaltung. And the second quote, in which Benjamin implicitly distinguishes between Spätsein and Nachsein, so between temporality of the belatedness, which would correspond to the inner life of language, and the temporality of chronological succession, which is not essential for the understanding of translation. And actually, to confuse these two temporalities would mean to deny one of the most powerful and fruitful historical processes, to say it in Benjamin's words. So from this second quote, actually, we clearly see the transformational capacities of the original happen in the dimension of später, as lateness. So transformation of the language of the original belongs to the register of being late, while Benjamin's mentioning of the subjectivity of the later generations as Nachgeborene indicates merely a dimension of succession, so that the difference between these two temporal orders actually underlines a certain difference between the subjective and the objective, or better to say, a difference between the mere reception of the text in later generations, that is a subjective fact, and objective fact of the inner life of language. However, translation essentially cannot be defined by its occurrence after a certain period in the life of the work, that is, by being merely nachfolgend. Only in the dimension of belatedness the original survives, and it survives through its constant transformation in translations. But again, how to understand this dimension of belatedness, this temporal gap? What are its repercussions on the textual and linguistic character of the translation? The mode of existence of translation, this is also one of the points of Benjamin's text, is a certain incommensurability between translated text and the language of its translation. My claim here would be that this distance the translation language transmits manifests itself due to the temporal dimension of delay, of belatedness. There is thus a temporal distance and excess regarding the source text, even though the source text seems always actual, always in time. In the delay of translation, the source text is transformed while its language becomes open for a new dimension where it can grow. While the surviving original no longer inhabits its own time, but in every epoch realizes its actuality, the translation does not inhabit its own time, so it is not only temporal, but also temporary. And actually, Benjamin stresses this double phase of being temporal and at the same time temporary, zeitlich and vorläufig. So translation is late, but we find it that it's also temporary, limited in time. Both these temporal characters of translation actually express a peculiar way in which translation establishes the relation with language. Translation can never inhabit language in the way that the original does, in the sense that in the original, the linguistic unity between the content and the source language is natural. And this is illustrated very well with Benjamin's example of the fruit and the peel, which actually exist in an organic natural unity. On the other side, the text of the translation is not totally in possession of its own language, or rather, its own language is not really its own. So the link between text and language is therefore more fragile and can be eroded by the course of the time and by modification that the language undergoes during the time. So the next step would be now to see how this dimension of belatedness is not only associated with the translation as practice, but also with the philosophy. One of the most famous examples of the recognition of the belatedness of philosophy is famous Hegel's quote, famous Hegel's passage from the preface to his Philosophy of Right. I will not read the whole passage, just the central sentence, where Hegel says that philosophy, in any case, comes on the scene too late to give it. Philosophie kommt immer zu spät. As the thought of the world, it appears only when actuality has completed its process of formation and attained its finished state. These claims of the belatedness of philosophical rationality have often been used as a definite proof of the substantial and ineluctable ineffectiveness of philosophy, which has only a passive role of the cognition post factum. Philosophy in this view would be unable to do anything but to cognize what the world has brought because it is too late to intervene. The world has already finished its own job, and philosophy has to reconcile itself with the results by building its adequate concept. So, philosophical elaboration would represent a point of minimal difference with the actuality, and the philosopher would be a kind of invisible translator whose task is to reproduce as much as accurate what the actuality has brought out. But definitely, and here I don't have time to go into the details, this is not the sense of Hegel's image of the all of Minerva, of the all of philosophy, which is always late. And there is much more than this simplistic image of passivity of philosophy offers. Actually, here we can employ the same argumentation that is valid for the relationship between the translation and the original. Translation cannot be a passive reproduction of the original, and it is not something external to the original, trying then to imitate it. Translation belongs to the process of constitution of the original as such, and the same is valid for philosophy. Its rationality is not imposed to the world from outside, it belongs intrinsically to the world. The effectiveness of philosophy consists exactly in recognizing that since the beginning it has played a, a constitutive role in the formation of reality. If we want, so to say, to shuffle the cards, then we could say that philosophy translates the content of the reality into the concepts insofar as this reality is already translational in its nature. Philosophy translates reality into concepts not as a passive reproduction or reconstruction of the real in the ideal, but it's more similar to Benjamin's continuation of the life of the original. So the actuality survives in another language, which is the language of concepts, language of philosophy. And this is how we should understand also too lateness of philosophy. Philosophy comes too late to the scene because the world to which it belongs is late as well. And this means it is characterized by certain distance and excess that constitutes its historicity, its transformability. Philosophy cannot teach the world what it should be, in the same way as translation cannot teach what the original should be. Translation is continuing the life of the original in another language, as well as philosophy is continuing the life of the world in another language, in the language of concepts. This does not mean reconciliation with what is translated, but rather its transformation. And as we have seen, this translational transformation of the original has been staged due to the temporality of delay. So delay is a sign of this peculiar lack of time and peculiar loss in the time, which holds philosophy in the constant openness toward the world. In this sense, we can say that belatedness is not defect, it is not a handicap. The lateness of translation happens in the right moment. It is the right delay, so to say, so to say, because it is the way of keeping the original alive. And the same goes for philosophy. Delay is the way in which historical process of the world remains open. So we can say that the delay is the kairos of both philosophy and translation. Belatedness is uh, constitutive for philosophy as well for translation, because belatedness is necessary to keep the historical dimension open. I would like now to give a few conclusive remarks. I adopted here the approach that analyzes a specific temporal order, that of the delay, in order to show affinities between philosophy and translation. The affinity, which actually is also stated in Benjamin's text when he writes that there is no muse of philosophy and there is also no muse of translation. This approach that addresses the temporality, if developed further, can be very productive, according to me, regarding many questions in the philosophy of translation. But the primary question to address would be the question of philosophy of translation as such. So the question that we can pose are, what are the main features of the philosophy of translation? If philosophy is akin to translation, does then philosophy of translation have a specific status? I would endorse somehow this claim and put forth the view that philosophy of translation necessarily puts us in front of the inquiry of what philosophy as such is. So the distinction of the philosophy of translation from other theoretical approaches in the vast field of translation studies would be exactly in this self-reflective grasp of philosophy. In other words, philosophy of translation is only that perspective which envisages itself as akin to the very translational practice. So this is the perspective that does not take translation as an external object of analysis. Philosophy of translation, therefore, addresses the question of addresses the nature of philosophy itself. This also means that philosophy of translation must go beyond the descriptive or normative approach to the practice of translation. Or to say this in terms of our argument, and this would be my conclusion, it is too late for philosophy to teach with what translation as practice ought to be, because translational practice already speaks the language of philosophy. Thank you for your attention.